P. Agian. He is a prolific speaker and professor at Collège de France and London School of Economics. He's fellow of Econometric Society and American Academy of Arts and Science. His research work includes economics of growth. He pioneered Schumpeterian growth paradigm, which was subsequently used to analyze the growth of the growth policy and role of state in growth process. His wonderful on endogenous growth theory. Today he's going to talk to power of creative destruction and economic upheaval and the wealth of the nation. Before he starts, I would request our chairman, our Professor Dr. Arvind Virmani, to formally introduce Philippi Agian. Over to Dr. Virmani ji.
Thank you very much. I was going to introduce him. Okay, so let me start on an informal note. When Dr. Charan Singh told me that he had got Professor Agian to speak to us, I was thrilled. You know, I'm pretty old, probably perhaps older than Professor, I don't know. But I was really thrilled to hear, because most of my adult life I've spent in the field of macroeconomics and growth, and Professor Agian is a legend in the field. So with those, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to speak at the EGROW Foundation. With that, let me just briefly point out to the listeners a few of your academic connections. So Professor Agian is currently professor at the economics of economics at the London School of Economics and the Collège de France, and an invited professor at the Paris School of Economics. He's also been the Robert C. Wagner Professor of Economics at Harvard University and professor at the University College of London and Oxford Fellow at Nuffield. I mean, that really gives you an idea of, how long ago, having been a student and an advisor on macroeconomics and growth for a quarter of a century. I've heard his name, I don't know how many times over this quarter century. It's already mentioned some of his work with Peter Hewitt on Schumpeterian paradigm, etc. And I would say that I've always found Professor Agian a very innovative thinker. His work on institutions and institutional economics and their role in growth has been fascinating. So it's glad, I'm very happy that our usual listeners at EGROW will have the great opportunity. In fact, I'm happy that I will have an opportunity to listen to you, Professor. Thank you for coming, and please
thank you so much.
Start your talk.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me. And it's an honor to be with you. Our thoughts these days are a lot with India. I know that you are going through very difficult times. I know that Sharon himself was, is in bed today because in hospital because of COVID. Very kindly listening to us, and very much, we are thinking of you, and I don't we're doing we don't do enough, and we should do much more to make sure that you will pass this COVID dramatic step. So I will present, I will outline what we've done in this book. This book was based on 5 years of teaching at the Collège de France. Collège de France is a special institution which in fact, the Collège de France, I explained that there, it's a place where you allow public access to research, to frontier research. So that's what it's all about. You teach the public. Anybody can attend lectures at Collège de France, and mostly they are non-specialists, they are non-economists. So you have to explain frontier research to a non-specialized audience. And every year you have to change, to teach new things. So over the past 5 years, I have been there for, I did already 5 courses there. I accumulated material on growth economics, and particularly on the kind of stuff that the approach, the Schumpeterian approach that I've been working in since 1987. So in fact, what we've done here is to allow public access to the research produced collectively over the past 35 years to operationalize Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction. What do we mean operationalize? That means we collectively developed models based on creative destruction that shed new light on several aspects of growth and development, and we confronted these models to new data sets, mostly micro data. And there is a continuous back and forth between data and modeling, okay? That's what we've done. So the starting point was, here is Schumpeter, was this notion of creative destruction put forward by Schumpeter, by which we mean the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. And in fact, what I did first with Peter Howitt, as you mentioned, we started working in 1987, and it came out in 1992 econometrica paper, was to take those ideas and make a model out of them, because there was no such thing as a model by Schumpeter. There was no such thing as empirical analysis by Schumpeter. You needed to build the whole thing. So the first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon the shoulders of previous innovators. The second idea is that innovation do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovation displace old technologies, make them become obsolete. So at the heart of creative destruction, there is a contradiction. On the one hand, you need to motivate innovators by the prospect of innovation rents. But on the other hand, there is this temptation for innovators to use those rents to prevent future innovations and block new entry, because the subsequent innovation will tend to make them obsolete. And so the whole thing, regulating capitalism, is about managing this contradiction, that you need to give rents to inventors, but make sure they don't use them to prevent subsequent innovation. Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism. He believed that the first innovators would turn it into conglomerates, and that the conglomerates would make sure, by colluding with the state in particular, to make sure that no subsequent innovation would ever occur. So Schumpeter himself was very pessimistic about the future of capitalism. But in this book, we explain why things didn't go that bad. We kept having innovators, and why, in fact, we can replace Schumpeter's pessimism by what we call an optimism of the will, or fighting optimism. And what are the main levers, the main instruments for averting the pessimism of Schumpeter? Okay. So just creative destruction, to tell you that it's not just an abstract concept, but you can measure creative destruction. Here we measure it by the flow of patents. Here is work by Ufuk Eksigi, John Grigsby, and Tom Nicholas, showing the positive correlation cross-state US, cross-state US, between the average annual flow of patents in a state over the 20th century, and on the one hand, and the annual growth of per capita GDP in that state, on average annual over the century. And you see that states in the US which on average patented more grow on average faster in terms of per capita GDP growth. But in fact, they show in their paper that this relationship is not just a correlation, it's a causal link from innovation to growth. But one way to measure creative destruction is the flow of patents, you see. And that's what that's one way to measure creative destruction. Another way to measure creative destruction is job creation, job destruction, or churning of firms, the flow of destruction of firms and the flow of creation of firms. And then again, you have a positive correlation between that measure and per capita GDP growth. So now what we do in the book is to use the lens of creative destruction and of the paradigm that I outlined above to do three things. First is to revisit some main enigmas in economic history. The second is to question some common wisdom, some wrong economic advice, I believe. And three, to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me go into each of those in turn. Okay, some historical enigma. The first enigma is industrial takeoff. You know, there's been episodes of growth everywhere in the world, but they were never long-lasting. Where really growth took up worldwide was in 1820 when you had the Industrial Revolution in England, which then came to France, then the US, the steam engine revolution, and then growth started to take off. And of course, a big enigma that which we deal with in chapter 2 of the book is why it happened in Europe in 1820, so recently, just 200 years old. And there, Joel Mokyr is someone that gives you the hints. But what's amazing is that the hints of Joel Mokyr are exactly mapping the Schumpeterian paradigm. First, Mokyr stresses the importance of openness to be able to build upon previous innovators. So that's, you know, in particular, the printing made it possible, postal services, universities that the free universities had developed, and also on the encyclopedia, Diderot and the encyclopedia, that which allowed the knowledge to be codified so that you could build on the knowledge of your predecessors, of previous innovators. So that's the number one condition here. The number two is that thanks to the glorious revolution in England, and then in France to the French Revolution, and then subsequently with Napoleon Bonaparte, they developed, you know, and the US from the start, property right protection. You had institutions to protect property rights, and therefore an innovator would have his property rights protected to some extent. So that was very important to have those institutions. And the third one is creative destruction. In China, you had innovations, but whenever you had innovation in China or inventions, you know, they invented the compass in China. They invented, you know, the wheel. In India also you had many innovations. But in China, what would happen, whenever someone would innovate, the emperor would make sure that that guy would be neutralized because they were afraid of losing power to these innovators. Whereas in Europe, thanks to the competition between France, England, Prussia, Russia, if scientists would be persecuted in one of the countries, he could always migrate to another country, which would then use his knowledge or her knowledge and compete with the previous country. You see, that's cross-country competition. Well, did a lot to make creative destruction possible in Europe. So that's the enigma of the takeoff. There is the enigma of the technological waves and the effect on employment. Very, very interestingly, that's the wave, you know, that's the evolution of TFP growth in the US. Here it's in Japan, and here is in Europe. But the thing which is very interesting is that the Eurozone, is that, you know, you have these delays, you know, between the invention of the bulb and the top of the electricity wave, which is long after Edison. There is a delay. Why the delay come? Because you have, of course, a lot of incumbent habits that delays the diffusion of what we call a general purpose technology and its transformation into a technological wave. And chapter 3 talks a lot about that. The other thing that we talk a lot about in chapter 3 is why none of the industrial revolutions led to mass unemployment, contrary to what some predicted. You know, you had the Luddites movement in England when you had the steam engine revolution by workers who were afraid that steam engine machines would replace manpower. So, similarly, when you had the electricity revolution in the US, Keynes said, well, I predict mass unemployment. Never occurred, never happened. And that I will get back to that. And that's what we try to understand in chapter 3. In fact, firms that automate, they create jobs, but I will get back to that later. So the third one is secular stagnation. You see here, I'm showing the average annual growth of TFP in the US. Year between 1950 1995, year between 1995 2005, and since 2005. And you see that since 2005, growth has gone down in the US before the COVID. But since 2005, and that's strange because you had the IT revolution, and you had at the same time the AI revolution. And what we argue is that in fact what happened is that, you know, the IT revolution allowed large firms like, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Walmart to expand a lot. So that during their expansion period, that was the high growth in the US. But when they expanded to most sectors of the economy, they stifled innovation by non-superstar firms. So that again goes back to Schumpeter, contradiction. Yesterday's innovator becomes a barrier to today's innovation. And that we talk a lot in chapter 6 of the book. But we say the way around that is to revive competition policy in the US to make competition policy adapted to the digital era. And we have a whole discussion of that. And again, is this contradiction between, I innovate, but the innovators use their rants to prevent subsequent innovation. The middle income trap is another one which is very important. You see, that's Argentina per capita GDP as a fraction of US per capita GDP was essentially, Argentina was growing as fast almost as the US between 1870 and 1930. And then Argentina started slowing down compared to the US. But you see, you have other countries like Korea that did much better than Argentina, but started to grow very fast after World War II. And then in the late 90s or the mid 90s, went slower. There was a slowdown in Korea. And Japan is an advanced country, so it's not middle income trap, it's an advanced income trap, where Japan grew very fast between World War II and the late 80s. And then Japan started to slow down. And then we argue that what happened is that those countries were growing because of catch-up growth. They were catching up, and they had institutions which were good for catching up. Limited competition is no problem. Limited labor market flexibility is no problem. They were essentially catching up. But when at some moment you need to move from imitation enhancing institutions to innovation enhancing institutions, and the problem is that the conglomerate that developed in these countries during the catching up period, in Korea, we call this conglomerate showballs, in Japan, we call them keretsus, not only they prevented new entry, but they also pressured governments to not move to institutions that would favor frontier innovation. Because when you need to go to frontier innovation in competition, product market competition becomes much more important, labor market flexibility becomes much more important. And neither Japan or Korea moved towards more competition and more market flexibility. And so, because the incumbent firms would prevent that move, and again, we are facing Schumpeter's contradiction. And that's chapter 7 of the book. Another enigma is the source of dynamic of inequality. But what's we know that top income inequality has gone up since 1980s, the work of Piketty, Saez, and Atkinson. But what's interesting is to understand the relationship between inequality and innovation. Here, that's work that I did with Axigit, Bergeau, Blandalemus. So all on inequalities in chapter 5 of the book. And what we show is that, you see, innovation is a source of top income inequality. The reason is that if you go back to the basic paradigm, when you innovate, you get innovation rents. When you get your innovation rents, that moves you to the top income. But on the other hand, there is creative destruction. So you see, what's very interesting is that you find again when you look at inequality, because you see here, this is a cross-US panel, cross-US state panel analysis, and the same state in the US might be in different points here depending on the year. In terms of innovation intensity, we measure innovation intensity by the flow of patents. And you can see that states which are more innovative have also a higher share of income for the top 1%. So there is indeed, and you can show that it's causal. So innovation is a source of top income inequality. But what's very interesting is that innovation has no effect on more global measure of inequality, which is the Gini. And why is that? Is because innovation has two counteracting effects on inequality. On the one hand, innovation raises top income inequality because, of course, innovators get rents from innovation. But on the other hand, because of creative destruction, innovation induces social mobility, and the social mobility reduces global inequality. So the overall effect of innovation on global inequality is the resultant of, at the same time, pushing rents, but also pushing social mobility. And overall, you see that innovation has no effect on global inequality as measured by the Gini. Whereas lobbying, and we contrast in the book innovation with lobbying, we contrast Steve Jobs with Carlos Slim. Lobbying is a source of top income inequality, but when you do lobbying, it means that incumbent firms collude with the state to prevent new innovators. Lobbying, in fact, reduces growth, unlike innovation, which increases growth. Lobbying reduces social mobility because you prevent new innovators from coming. And therefore, in fact, you can show that lobbying not only increases top income inequality, but lobbying increases the Gini. So you have two sources of top income inequality. On the one hand, innovation. On the other hand, lobbying. So on the one hand, Steve Jobs. On the other hand, Carlos Slim. And but the effects on growth and global inequality are very different. Innovation is a good source of top income inequality because innovation increases social mobility and therefore does not affect global inequality. And at the same time, innovation generates growth. Whereas lobbying reduces social mobility. It increases both top income inequality and the Gini, and lobbying reduces growth because it prevents new inventors from entering. So you see, you have to be very careful when you talk about inequality to know whether it's innovation you're talking about or other sources of top income inequality. You cannot treat them as if they were all the same. And that's very important. Now, should you worry about the top income? I don't mind that there are rich people as long as they don't use their wealth to prevent new innovations. So again, there you have to worry about the rich, but not because it's a problem to have rich people. It's because if they use their wealth to prevent new innovators. But for that, taxation is one way, but also competition policy is very important. And that brings me back to what I was mentioning when I was talking about secular stagnation. So that is the chapter 5 of the book. So that's I just mentioned a few enigma. There are other enigma that the book looks at, like structural change and other things. So that's the first part of the book. So let me pause for 1 minute. 1 second. Let me just fill up my glass of water. Okay, so now the second thing that the book does is to question some common wisdoms. One common wisdom is that we should tax robots to protect employment. But you see, here is a study, that's chapter 3 of the book, and we look at the effect of automation on at the firm and plant level on job creation. And we show that firms or plants that automate, they create jobs. And I know you say that's strange because you would think that machines would replace manpower. But there you see, the thing is that firms that automate, they become more productive. And how you know they become more productive? Because the export price goes down. They are able to produce at lower cost. Because they produce at lower cost, their sales go up. So what happens is that there might be a substitution effect to some extent of manpower by machines, but on the other, of labor by machine. But on the other hand, the firms that automate, they become more productive, more competitive, and therefore they can enlarge their market. Because they enlarge their market, there is a bigger demand for their product, and therefore they demand more employment. So you see, that might explain why neither the steam engine revolution nor the electricity revolution led to mass unemployment, because you have this productivity effect, which more than counteracted the substitution effect. So taxing robots is a bad idea, because if you tax robots, you prevent firms from innovating, from becoming more productive, and therefore from increasing market size and employment. So bad idea to tax robots. Second bad idea, the second wrong idea is that taxation is the only instrument to make growth more inclusive. I believe in taxation to pay for education for everybody of high quality, to pay for health services, to pay for active labor market policy, to pay for industrial policy. I need taxation. So I am not a sort of guy, I'm not Trump who says put tax at zero. You see what I mean? I believe very much in taxation and in progressive taxation. But this being said, it's not the only instrument to make growth more inclusive. Another one is education. I think to have a broad education is a big way to make growth more inclusive. To have good schools accessible to everybody. You know, one can criticize China a lot, but I think China, something they did well is to educate their population. Why is China did it so well at catching up? Because everybody in China goes to school, and there are good schools for everybody. the young boys, young girls, everybody. That I think is a huge achievement of the Chinese Revolution, to be honest. There are many things that they did wrong, but the education they did right, like the Cuban Revolution, I think they did right to put everybody at school. So one day when they will free their economy, because they are well educated, they will do miracles. So I think education is at the heart of inclusive growth. It's very important to have good schools, because at school you don't only learn acquire knowledge, but you learn to learn, and therefore you can adapt to situations. So I think education for all is very important. What's also very important is that you see, I mentioned to you, innovation is induces social mobility. So it's important to have innovation there, because we know, because of creative destruction, that explains why innovation and social mobility are positively correlated. So if you overtax capital, I think Biden is right to increase tax, but I would not increase tax in France, for example, nowadays, because if I tax more capital income in France, I would discourage innovation, which would be bad for social mobility as much as it does for growth. And what's very interesting is that we explain in chapter 5 that firms that innovate, they create more what we call good jobs, jobs that promote more, because the jobs in innovating firms have to be done right. So it's very important, even the low educated, that they be coordinated and made, articulated with the other assets of the firm. So innovating firms train much more their workers and give them much more good prospects. The upper curve is the wage profile of a worker over his lifetime in an innovating firm, whereas the dotted line is the wage profile in a non-innovating firm. And you see the prospects are always better. You have a higher and steeper wage profile in an innovating firm. So you need innovation. So my view on the whole thing is that the taxation is a good instrument, but you need education, you need innovation, you also need competition, because I told you that the big danger would be that you would have big firms that prevent newcomers, and that would go against social mobility. So competition policy is also very important. Fighting lobbying is very important, because I told you that lobbying is very bad. And also rules for financing political campaigns. In the US, private company can finance political campaigns without limit. But in Sweden, where I am today, that's impossible. You cannot. You have very strict rules for financing political campaigns. So you see, inequality to making growth more inclusive, you need a set of instruments, not just taxation. You need taxation, education, innovation, competition policy, and rules for financing political campaign, and fighting lobbying. All those guys are important. Another common wisdom is that protectionism is the way to regain control of value chains. Here I'm showing France versus Germany in what I call the anti-COVID products. So there, it doesn't include the vaccines. As I just say, masks, respirators, and tests. We were almost as good, the French, as Germany in the early 2000s. And look at Germany. That's German exports, that's German imports. That means that Germany, by the way, imports a lot. But today, nowadays, they have 20 billion euro, yearly 20 billion euro trade surplus in those products. Whereas France did not improve at all. Because Germany is not because Germany put tariffs. They didn't put any tariff. They just innovated, and they just invested in innovative investments. And I think that's much better. Because if you do a trade war, the problem with the trade war is that the destination countries will retaliate. They will therefore close your export market. And we explain in chapter 13 of the book that in that case, that in fact impairs, will discourage your own innovation, because I innovate because I can export. So if I stop having export market, yes? You want me to stop? Hello? Are you there?
Yeah, please, everybody mute yourself. Somebody had the microphone on. Please continue, Professor.
Okay, so the last common wisdom is that zero or negative growth is the best response to the climate challenge. But then we had a natural experiment. The natural experiment is that, we had with the lockdown, the first lockdown in France, GDP went down 30%, March, April, May 2020. But CO2 emissions went down by only 8%. So the solution to the climate challenge is not zero negative growth. It is green innovation. The problem here I have green patents and non-green patents in automotive industry. Until 2005, it is now converging a bit since then. But the problem is that firms that have innovated polluting technologies in the past, they continue to innovate in polluting technology in the future. So that's what we call path dependence. Because of this path dependence in the direction of technical change, you need the state to redirect technical change of the firms. How they can do that? Through carbon tax, that's one way. Through industrial policy. In France, we build nuclear plants, we build hydroelectric plants, we give R&D subsidies, we do industrial policy to push towards green innovation. But there is also the role of civil society, consumers. Now that become informed with B Corps, they become informed about the CO2 content of the various products. And so they can choose to purchase from firms that are doing well on the in terms of not limiting CO2 emissions. And now you see, so there is a role for the state, but also a role for civil society, starting with consumers, to redirect the technical change of firms towards green technologies, because spontaneously firms that innovated, especially incumbent firms that used to innovate in dirty technologies, would keep innovating in dirty technologies. So that's all what we do in chapter 9 of the book. Okay, so now the third thing that the book does is to help us rethink capitalism. So give me 1 minute to drink, and then I go to that part. So lessons from COVID. COVID reveals various things. COVID revealed first that the social model in the US is more broken than we thought. But the other thing it revealed is that the European ecosystem of innovation is not good. We should improve on innovation. The US has to improve on social, Europe has to improve on innovation. So here is from Case and Deaton. Anne Case and Angus Deaton, looked at the evolution of the death of despair. The death of despair is those who die from suicide or substance abuse. And you can see that the white non-Hispanic of age between 50 and 54 in the US, they had the death of despair grew very, very steeply since the early 2000s. And the other curves are the evolution of the average mortality rate for the same age range in other developed countries. And you see that, really US stands out. Why is that? And Deaton and Case, they argue that it's very much job insecurity, which also, increases family instability. That's what causes suicides, opioid absorption, and all that. Whereas that's the US model for you. The Danish model in Denmark, because they have this wonderful flex security system, when you lose your employment, you get 90% of your salary for at least 2 years. You get government support to retrain and find a new job. In fact, you see, Alexandra Roulet showed that when you lose your job in Denmark, it has no effect on the purchase of antidepressants. You see time 0. You can see now, no, after is like before. And so what they do, what Alexandra Roulet there does, is to compare the health of Danish workers whose place of employment closed between 2001 and 2006 with workers that are identical in all respects, age, experience, skill, etc., but whose employing firm did not close during that period. And in fact, what you can see here is that the firm closure does not seem to impact, here the consumption of antidepressants. And here it does not impact either the probability of visiting hospital for cardiovascular disease, but also it does not affect mortality either. So that's the superiority of the Danish model. But now if you look at COVID, here you can see that COVID in the US increased the unemployment rate. But when you lose employment in the US, you are likely to also lose, access to, health insurance. And you see that the fraction of American citizens who lost health insurance increased markedly during COVID. Whereas in Germany, everybody got health insurance throughout. No effect of COVID. You could look similarly at poverty rates. You see, poverty remains constant in Germany, went up with COVID in the US. So from the point of the social model in the US is not a good model. Okay, but on the other hand, on innovation, US is much better. Here I'm showing the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants in the US is way above everybody, everywhere else. And there is no mystery there. It's because, as we explained in chapter 12, so all the Danish versus US, that's explained in chapter 11. All the ecosystem of innovation, that's in chapter 12. And we show that in the US, basic research in biotech, you have the National Science Foundation, you have the National Institute of Health, you have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is sponsored from the private foundation to finance basic research on biotech. All that but for basic research. But then you have the BARDA, which is the Biologic Advanced Research Development Agency, that can turn a basic knowledge into industrial applications within a year. So, for example, the vaccines, the ARN messenger technology was there, but you had to turn that into massive production of vaccines within a year. It's the BARDA who did it. And the BARDA, they spent $12 billion for that. The Europeans on total spent $4 billion, much less than the US. So the US, they have the BARDA, but they also have venture capital and institutional investors that also help finance innovation. So in Europe, we need really to update our innovation institutions to become competitive, because otherwise it's China and the US who are leading the game. So US has to work on this social model. Europe has to work on this innovation model. So now that's what I say, combine the good side of the American model with the good side of the European model. I want to be Danish on protection and I want to be American on innovation. Now what's key, I go back to the initial, I want to go back to the initial question. Schumpeter was pessimistic because he thought that the innovators of yesterday would turn into conglomerates that would collude with the state to prevent new innovations. So now you could say, well, but the state is complicated with the state. You have the executive, you have the legislative, and you have the judiciary. So already the judiciary puts checks and balances on the executive. That's true, but the Constitution is an incomplete contract, and it's not clear that the separation of power will be truly enforced. For example, Colombia has the same constitution as France, but the reality of life in Colombia is nothing to do with France. In Colombia, when you are a union leader, you are shot. In Colombia, when you protest in the street, you are shot. It's nothing to do with France, nothing to do. And the constitution is the same. So it's very important the role of civil society. The civil society plays a very important role. So in fact, as I hear, constitutions are incomplete contract, but we explained that in chapter 15. Therefore, society plays a crucial role as a means to ensure the effective implementation, the effective enforcement of the constitutional contract. They take constitutional safeguards from theory into reality. And that's why you need a triangles. In a sense, going back to Schumpeter, the firms innovate, but they may collude with the state to prevent future innovations. It's true, separation of powers help to some extent, but it's really civil society which puts the true checks and balance on the state and make sure that competition will be enforced, and therefore that the collusion between incumbent firms and the state will be limited. So you need a triangle between firms, state, and civil society. Once you have that triangle working well, you can avert Schumpeter's pessimism and turn it into what I call optimism of the will. Okay, two examples to explain the role of civil rights of the civil society. One example is the fight for civil rights in the US. After the Civil War, the US Constitution was amended to guarantee equal rights to all races. So you had the 15th Amendment, which would give African Americans the right to vote. Yet many states in the South used poll taxes or unfairly implemented literacy tests to effectively prevent African Americans from voting. And it took the civil rights movement to eventually get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, banning voters' literacy tests. Another example is May 68 in France, which the movement which led the executive power to introduce new possibilities to seize the Constitutional Council, to contest the constitutionality of laws. And that contributed a lot to democratize power in France. But without the May 68 movement, you would not have had this true more democratic enforcement of the constitution. So that's the outline of the book. In chapter 1, we describe the Schumpeterian paradigm. We show how to measure creative destruction, and we describe a bit the problematics, what you can do with it, and the outline of the book. Chapter 2 is about the takeoff enigma. Chapter 3 about the technological wave enigma. Chapter 4, we talk about the relationship between competition and innovation. Chapter 5 is about inequality, innovation, and taxation. Chapter 6 about secular stagnation. Chapter 7 about middle income trap. Chapter 8, structural change. Can you go directly from agriculture to services, bypassing mass industrialization? It seems that in some parts of India you did. That would be very interesting. We analyzed that in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is about green innovation. Chapter 10, we looked at who are the inventors, the parents. We showed that the parents tend to be, higher income and higher educated. And that tells you that you need to have broad education to have more people who can be truly inventors. That's important. Chapter 11, we talk about the effect of creative destruction on health and happiness, contrasting Denmark and US in particular. Chapter 12, we talk about financing creative destruction. That's why we talk about the ecosystem of innovation in US compared to other countries. Chapter 13 is about the globalization, where we discuss, the negative effect of trade wars in response to import shock. Chapter 14, we show how historically the state as an investor in education and health emerged, and how historically the state as an insurer emerged. The importance of wars for the emergence of investor state, and the importance of crises for the emergence of the insurer state. And at the end of chapter 15, we look at this magic triangle that I just described between firm, state, and civil society, and we discuss the future of capitalism in the conclusion. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me, I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. You've done a tour de force of over the growth scenario. So let me just start off with one question. Oh, we have Suman here. So maybe after me, Suman can ask a question. You mentioned structural change. I don't know how familiar you are with the Indian economy. I'll just take one or two sentences. Basically, in India, after 70 years of independence, we still have the agricultural economy is down to about 18% of GDP, but we still have 50% of the labor force in agriculture. So from your international experience, is there any suggestions or things which could work in, obviously it's been delayed a lot for various reasons, but from your international experience, can you suggest some things which may be relevant for India?
I know that in the 90s, I don't know if that was true, because it's always, I would have a lot of humility, India, and I don't. So I know in the 90s there were some policies to make it, when you remove the license Raj, or where you liberalize trade, those were policies that spurred growth in India, as far as I know. I looked at that at the time with Fabrizio Zilibotti, Robin Burgess, and so we looked at that at the time, but I don't know if more has been done. And the question to say, could you bypass mass industrialization? I know you had the infant industry argument at some moment, but it could be that when you have IT and AI and trade openness, maybe there are ways that you can go to service-led growth much more easily. So I know that Fabrizio Zilibotti and Michael Peters have a recent paper on that. I started working with them on that paper, but I thought they had done much more than I did, and I decided to pull out of the project because I felt I prefer to be a net creditor than a net debtor. But in the book, in chapter 8, I mentioned that work, and I tried to entertain the possibility that, if you have sufficiently IT, AI, and trade openness, you could move to a service-led more rapidly. And so I want to. So they took as an example some parts of India to make their point. I wonder if that is not something that can be generalized. One big advantage of that is pollution, because we know that when you go through mass industrialization, CO2 emissions are huge. we know that if you exclude transport, services pollute 4 times less than industries. So I think if we could, anything that would move you to service-led earlier would be good for the whole world also. So that's what I am. Voilà, that's the issue. So that is discussed in chapter 8 of the book. But I also refer you to the work of Zili Botti and Michael Peters, which is how far I know on that.
Okay, thank you. So Suman, do you want to lead? Dr. Vishandas, you want to start, and then maybe Suman can comment. Yeah.
Sorry, but is it me or Vishandas? I thought Vishandas had left. Okay, oh, fine. Who would you
Go
like?
ahead, Suman. Suman, you go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Philippe. Very stimulating, and three points, actually. The first is the point you just made. How should one conceptually distinguish between developed and developing countries? And I have in mind here that if you look at the at the Madison tables as updated by Groningen, a country like China today is, I think, at roughly the per capita income that the US would have been in the 1930s. So if you believe that the US, both in terms of macro management and in terms of an innovation structure, began its journey in the middle of the 20th century, the issue is, should one partition the innovation capabilities between developed and developing countries as sharply as we do, or are we talking about a continuum?
Yeah, I think it's not continuum.
May I just add just three, as it were, reference points that.
Yeah.
So I would also I would request you've talked about Schumpeter, but how would you say your worldview on the role of the state compares with that of Matsukato on the one hand, which is a strong state present, and of Ned Phelps on the other, who talks really about an innovation culture in Victorian England, which was a culture of optimism. It was really, at one level, your point about civil society, which is to say that the role of government is to create a culture of optimism and entrepreneurship, and arguably one could say that this is part of what the Modi government is engaged in right now. And finally, on your magic triangle, there's a lot of pessimism in Acemoglu and Johnson about the capability of the now developing economies, China and India, to negotiate the narrow corridor, saying that civil society is not likely to withstand the pressures of coming from an autocratic state, and therefore the route to a liberal society that was pioneered in the Atlantic economies is unlikely to be followed by the large developing economies today. A lot to throw at you, but it's just a sign of how stimulating your lecture was.
Yeah.
And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, you asked many important questions. Each of them would deserve a full lecture to answer. So on the first question, on where do you put developed versus developing? I don't think it's discrete. I don't say up to certain as of a certain point you become developed or you're developing. Where you mentioned Darren Acemoglu, we had the work that we did with Acemoglu and Zili Botti on distance to frontier. Where we say when you are far below frontier, you do more catching up growth. And then as you move closer, you want to move more into frontier growth, which is more innovation driven. But of course, a country is composed of firms. So in a country, some firms are more frontier than others, and then you average over the firms. So the chapter called Middle Income Trap is very much based on the work that I did with Darren and Fabrizio. With this view that you had some countries, they had imitation enhancing institutions, and they have problems moving to innovation base. It's true even for advanced countries. Japan is you could say it's an advanced country, but it suffers from the middle income trap syndrome because the big conglomerates there, they prevent Japan from moving to more frontier innovation enhancing. So you see, so I would not say that it's something for the developed. I say there is this tendency, the more frontier you are, the more you want to move to frontier innovation. And so China, it's true, has moved a lot towards frontier innovation. Still, I believe, but maybe I'm wrong, that to be really a frontier innovator, you need freedom. So when you compare China today with the US in 1930, it's true in terms of GDP per capita, yes, but there is a big difference that China has no freedom and the US have freedom. And I think freedom is crucial to induce frontier innovation for at least two reasons. When you have more freedom, you tend to have less corruption and more competition, although you have a big lobbying and competition problem in the US nowadays. So, but it's true that on average, we know when you have more political freedom, you tend to have less corruption and more competition. The other thing which favors frontier growth, frontier innovation. But the other thing is that I believe that to make Kenyan innovation, to do the very innovative stuff, it helps a lot having freedom. I believe that Zuckerberg, he went to Harvard. In Harvard, he had humanities. I think humanities are very important. Why? Not only because I think humanities in themselves are important, because when you come to university, you are the product of your family. You are essentially the son of your parents or the daughter of your parents, okay? And you are from your family, your milieu, etc. When you go into humanities, philosophy, sociology, economics, you discuss, you learn to argue. And you learn to get out of you stop being a pure product of your education. You have the opportunity with humanities to get out, to grow out of what you were. And that favors innovativeness, I believe. You see, so that's why I believe that to have humanities and to have freedom in humanities, it helps a lot having a more innovative mind. I think the Kenyan innovations are mainly made in places where you are free to say whatever you want, where you're not afraid that you'll be arrested, where you are not there with humanities, becoming like this because, you can't do really social science as you want. So that's what I truly believe. It's true that China, they were smart enough to send people to the US, so they free ride on the freedom of the US and other countries. So that might have helped them so far. But I'm really working on this issue now of freedom and frontier innovation. I believe freedom is a very important part of this. So that's my take on. So that's what I want to say on frontier, non-frontier. The more frontier you are, the more you need innovation base. But innovation base requires freedom as well. And I believe without freedom, it puts bounds on how frontier you can be. That's my own view. Huh? You talk about I believe very much in the triangle. You see Macron, I'm very close to Macron, I like him very much. I know I've known him since 2007, I work with him and all that. When Macron tried to ignore civil society, he got the yellow vests and he had to deal with them. He thought he would save time by ignoring the unions, by ignoring the corps intermédiaire, as we call them. And at the end of the day, because of the yellow vest movement, his reform process was totally blocked for 2 years. So I believe in the need for civil society. Look at the US, the massive vote for Biden is because people could go and vote and try to prevent voting as much as they can. Now they try to introduce rules so that you cannot go and feed people who are queuing for the police stations because they don't want the poor to vote. The Trump people don't want the poor to vote. But there is a big movement of the voters which induces things. So civil society is there. When Trump arrived, there also that was it. There was nothing that you could do. But I think, look now, you have Biden. I don't say Biden is a miracle. They might make many mistakes. But you see, civil society plays an important role. May 68 played an important role. Big movements, the civil rights movement played an important role. I believe in that. In France, if you didn't have the unions, the congés payés, the paid holidays, the social security, all what we got in France, it didn't come for free. Without the unions and the civil society, none of that would have come. The capitalism that you had in France in the 19th century was bloody capitalism. You would shoot on workers who would strike in France. That was the way you would do business. in the 19th century. If you read Emile Zola, he will explain it to you. Or Victor Hugo, he tells you what happened when you go on strike in the 19th century. You are being shot at. Now it's no longer the case because you have the civil movement. So I mean, sometimes it can be blocked, but eventually it emerges. There is no automatism there. I'm not saying I'm an optimistic Panglossien. I'm like in Voltaire, Candide, where I am optimistic, I do nothing and it happens. But there are ways, and you can mobilize that, and there are instruments. And so it's a fine line, but I think it's much more useful to think like Carlin and Bowles, Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, in terms of the triangle between firms that innovate, the state, with more or less separation of power, and civil society, which completes the incomplete contract. So I worked a lot, I have a whole side of my work on incomplete contracts, and I worked on constitution as incomplete contract. And I believe that the role of civil society is to help enforce the incomplete contract, and to give content to the incomplete contract. And I think there is power there. It doesn't mean it happens overnight. You may wait a long time before this happens, but it ends up happening.
Thank you. Before I turn to Professor Vishwandas, I have a follow-up question. I'm sorry. As I said, your talk is so extensive and fascinating. I agree with you that external competition is as important as internal. You spoke against protectionism. But I have one problem, and that in a way you gave me an entry by talking about China as a free rider. I actually, and I would like to have your comments on this, because I actually proposed to my government what I call a dual trade policy. That is one policy, I mean, conceptually, how to implement it is a different issue. But conceptually, one policy from China, which has asymmetric trade technology. I've been studying China for decades, and noted these asymmetric policies decades before the experts on China mentioned them. But anyway, so the question is, do you have any sympathy for this view that China needs to be handled a little differently?
Sorry, what? So, can you repeat your question?
So I agree that we need to follow a competitive free trade policy with the rest of the world, but I believe that India and perhaps other countries need a kind of special approach to China, which has a fundamentally asymmetric approach.
Yeah, so I think China, on China, Turkey is a big country that I respect a lot. And they will find their own way. You see, so for example, I would never go there and say, disband the Communist Party and imitate Europe and the West. You find your own ways. We know that freedom is important. We know that competition is important. We know that there are ingredients that are important. How you get there? It's your own business. I will not tell you, I will not be a colonizer patronizing China and say, no, you should do this, not do that. But it's true that WTO, they didn't play it fairly. So it's not that they really violated the WTO, but you have the letter and the spirit of the contract. They didn't play the spirit of the contract. So I think that we need, when we negotiate WTO and we discuss that again, we need to make sure that they abide by the spirit of the WTO contract. That's true for everybody, by the way. It was also true for Australia. When Australia would turn into a pollution heaven, you should tell Australia you're not playing by the rules. You see what I mean? It's not just particularly to China. I think there are WTO rules, and everybody should play the rules. Unfair competition, you can have unfair competition because you have social dumping or because you have environmental dumping. You see what I mean? And tax dumping, and Biden and IMF are talking about that. And we should make sure that people play the game fairly. And I think that's what we should make sure. We cannot micromanage countries, but we can at least push more for the rules to be played fairly. So I am not in favor of tariffs per se, but I would use tariffs as a threat. You don't play by the rules, then I have the weapon of tariffs. But of course, it's like in chess game. The threat is better than the execution. You hope that you won't use the threat. That's your will. Okay, voilà. And so I think that's the carrot and stick approach, I think, is good.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Vishwandas.
Yes, sir. Yeah, Professor Philippi, it was a master. It was a masterful exposition on Schumpeterian. Coming back to Indian agriculture, as you know, the state policy of late has been to double the farmer's income. Now, in the process, we have moved from net importing country to self-sufficiency and now to net food exporting country. Yet the farmer's income has not increased commensurately, though the agriculture has developed. Now, government has recognized, the state of India has recognized this problem, and they have targeted the farmer's income should be doubled by 2024. In the process, a lot of innovations are taking place. Now, with the innovation, do you think this will lead to inequality? And in some sense, there is a protectionism also. The state is providing protection to the agriculture sector in particular. Will this protectionism lead to more regain the control by the state? So your view on this?
Very good. So, I don't know, but, I think it's important to support agriculture. I think it's important to provide safety nets in general. I will not answer what you do on agriculture because I'm really not competent. I think it's important to have the state providing safety nets. You need to give people possibilities and a safety net because you want people to be risk takers. An innovative society that my friend Phelps would tell you is a society where people take risks, but you take more risk when you know you have safety net. If you think that you have no safety net, you are very afraid of taking risk. So it's important. That's why I like the Danish system, because the Danish system pushes you to do more, but if you fail, you are protected. So I think it's very important that you have a safety net, but at the same time, you provide incentives. So I think it's very important to not punish failure and to reward success. So you need a system that does both. And so it may be that, you have a basic income from all type of activity, but at the same time, you encourage innovation and you encourage risk-taking. And you will encourage it more if people have, safety nets. I believe very much, I don't know if you're going skiing. When you go skiing, you will not go on the black slope right away. You need an instructor to tell you how to do it. And when you feel safe, you take more risk. And I think that's the name of the game. I think you see. So that's why I never believed that you had to choose between the American model and the Danish model. I believe that when the Danes invented the flex security system that I mentioned on the labor market, it was good for both for protection and for innovation. It was good for both. When you educate your population, it's good for both inclusiveness and growth. It's not a trade-off. It's not or. It's not that I choose the American model or the European model. No, I can have both. If I educate my population, I am more inclusive and I am more growth enhancing. If I provide good safety nets, I am more protective and more growth enhancing. And so my approach to agriculture might be that basic income you provide, but you also provide incentives to innovate.
Yeah. So let me just mention a question and then come back. I'm sorry to monopolize, but I have many questions myself. But one of the questions from outside, which you may want to take up after I give my question, which is on there seems to have been a lot of innovation in the pandemic. There's a saying that necessity is the mother of invention. So some comment on that. But before I do that, if you permit me, we have been pushing, apropos your safety nets, I have been pushing, and I think there is some now thinking on a version of a negative income tax. You recall that Friedman idea?
Yeah, so I work on that.
A variation of that, which I call the net income transfer system, is something we have been pushing. What is your view on that?
Yeah. So I push in France for a universal income for the young, but which is linked to incentives. And again, in Denmark, they did something very good. In Denmark, when you are a student and you leave your family, you have a monthly income, but you have to pass your exams. So you need to take exam and pass them. So you need to work. If you don't work, you don't get them. But you can also get a subsidy if you are an apprentice. Or you can get your subsidy if you are neither an apprentice nor a student, but you work a certain number of hours every week. For example, social services or things like that, which we need. We need to help the elder. We need to be tutorship for us young pupils and students. So, so I am in favor of an income, but always linked to something you do. You see, because I don't want to subsidize idleness. I want to subsidize activity and insertion. And so that's where the Danes have done very well. And I try to push Macron to emulate the Danish model there.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Now, on the other one, this necessity as a mother of invention, the pandemic and innovation.
Sorry, can you repeat the last one? Sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, so the specific question was during the pandemic and post, Mr. Ralapalli, post-pandemic, lots of innovation happened. And does the economy adapt to structural? I mean, basically, I'm translating that question. What do you think of innovation driven by necessity, kind of?
Yeah, that's right. So it was, in fact, people adapt. I think it happens a lot. People do now much more. I moved to Zoom. I didn't do Zoom before the pandemics. Yeah. And now we change my habits. I will never fly as often as I used to, because I will do many conferences by Zoom now. My habits have changed. People will resort more to teleconsultations. You see what I mean? They will do medical consultations online. They will do much more shopping online. I think that will last post-COVID. So there will be things that we'll go back to. I am eager to have the cafe of Paris opening again. That I will do as before. But I will show that habits will have changed. And so I believe that will prompt new change. And that forces some creative disruption. Of course, there will be more creative disruption because of COVID than there would have been without. But that's the good side, is that there will be new activities that will come, and I believe in that. And in third, we will have good surprise, because it has induced people to go much more into IT and into AI than they used to, and that will make many things possible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Is there anybody who has a question? There are lots of questions here, but I can't. Let's see if I can find some.
Here, sir, I have one question.
Okay, Dr. Jaina, go ahead.
Yeah. Sir, thank you, Professor Philippi, for your wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. It was very lucid lecture. But coming to the India, that my question is that now, more it's a question of livelihood and the employment issue. So I think more innovation is required for how you can sustain livelihood, and more innovation is required in case of health infrastructure, and more innovation is required how that unemployment issue can be tackled. So if you see that in the same line, like Thomas Piketty word, for the last decade, even if that more innovation has happened and technology has more advanced technology we have actually adopted, but inequality has been increased in case of India. So I want to know actually what is your intake on this, this thought.
Okay, can you rephrase, because I could not, the sound is not very good. Could someone rephrase, just because the acoustic was not very good. Did you understand the question, Arvin? Can you
Not really. When on labor, in India, we always worried about kind of unemployment, underemployment. The rural area, which I mentioned, 50% of labor force. There's also a lot of we call disguised unemployment, or underemployment, etc. So this whole concern with employment, how to generate employment, how to get back to employment.
Yeah, so the big challenge is, of course, innovation. There is always the fear that innovation would reduce employment. But as I showed you, you see with the big revolutions never led to massive unemployment. And you saw that firms that automate in France, they create employment because they innovate. So you create market size, in fact. So in fact, you see the employment consequences, but it's true that it's always better to educate. So anything you can do to educate your population will make them much more adaptable to changes. Because the problem is also when you move from one employment to the next, if you are educated, you adapt very quickly to a new technology, to a new employment. If you are not well educated, as at school, then it takes you much longer to adapt. So I think education is a very important investment.
Yeah, I think, right.
Yeah.
I'm glad you emphasized education because I think people here think of education with jobs, it's like a certificate to get a job. But people don't think that if you're better educated, you can also be small entrepreneur, you can be
You can
a
be an
little
entrepreneur.
innovator, you can be,
Yeah. You can be self-employed, you can be an entrepreneur,
yeah.
you can move from job to job, you can manage your life. You are autonomous. That's the thing. It gives you the ability to be mobile, you are flexible. And that's the big thing with education. That's what education gives you. So I think that's what I would very much, I would very much emphasize, the need for, high quality education throughout. And you are much more inventive. We know the inventive are people who are educated. That there is no question that education is a huge input into being inventive and risk taker. We know there is a link between the two. You take more risk when you are educated.
Yeah. Okay, there was one question on your last triangle. There were a number of questions. I don't know if you want to just add something more on the triangle.
The triangle, but I think the triangle is the key. I think really, you see, it works everywhere. I told you about the green innovation. You need firms to innovate green, but you need the state. With the state has the carbon tax and the industrial policy. But the civil society, you have the consumers, you have what we call corporate social responsibility, that they impose corporate social responsibility, and they play a very important role. So you see there the triangle being key. COVID as well, the innovation of vaccine was done by firms, but you needed the state. I talked about the BARDA, but you also needed civil society for the distance, the trace, test, and isolate. That very much work with civil society. You need the combination of the state and civil society also on COVID. That's why my friends Carlin and Bowles showed very well. And the basic thing that without the triangle, Schumpeter would be right to be pessimistic. He's not right to be pessimistic because you have the triangle, because you have the civil society with this potential too. And of course, some people think, well, civil society, because of the new revolutions, it will be more difficult to have the civil society. I don't think so. I think you will always have the possibility. For example, you see the vote in the US. They could vote by correspondence thanks to the technological progress. People could vote from home. They voted. Never so many people voted in an election like the last American election. That's technology that made it possible. And that allowed people who would never vote to vote. Georgia would never have gone for the Democrats. But finally, the have-nots could vote in Georgia, in the US. You see what I mean? So I'm less, it doesn't mean that things go well automatically, but I think that anything can be, you can have a bad use or a good use of things. And I think you can mobilize forces to direct things in the good direction.
You mentioned the institutions of innovation which the US has. Now we are trying to, in the process of setting up a National Science Foundation and some of those things. Is there any other pointers or suggestions or some insights from your research which you can give on that?
It's good to have, I think it's good to have something like the National Science Foundation. When you do industrial policy, try to emulate the DARPA model, which is a good model, the DARPA, because it's, always the problem with industrial policy is that you would pick winners. The DARPA, what's nice is that you don't pick winners. The money comes from the ministry, but then you have team leaders and they elicit many projects, and it's very transparent. So you reduce the scope for picking winners, the pitfalls of industrial policy. So if you have good governance, you can do a good innovation-based industrial policy with this kind of DARPA instrument. I think those elements, I think, help a lot. Having, and of course, whatever you can do to be attractive for foreign scientists and to have people moving that, you have already a lot of that. Already you are there, and But I would say, yeah, if you have a Science Foundation, maybe more in bio and have some kind of DARPA and BARDA, that would be already very, very good, actually.
Dr. Vishendas, do you see anybody else?
And of course, you need competition policy. So I mean, you need a mixture. Competition is very important because without competition, you don't have the innovation.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's see, any other questions? There were some people, do you want to just speak up? You wanted to ask questions? Ashok, do you see any questions?
Yeah, no, sir. Those questions are over.
Okay.
And before, sir,
I guess we've taken up 1 hour and 15 minutes. Should we conclude then?
yeah, time is up now.
Right. Okay. So, Professor Agion, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk, and maybe you'll, if this COVID continues, maybe you can give us another talk on some more of your books. Yes, you can hold up the book. People were asking.
Okay, here it is.
About your book. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
With that, let me hand over to Dr. Vishendas, who will just, do you have any announcements?
So, on behalf of EGROW Foundation, and on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Arun Virmani, I extend heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Professor Philippe Aguillon. It was a masterful exposition. You covered a lot of depth and width on the subject, which is very well received by most of the participants and the audience. And I thank you from the core of my heart for such a wonderful presentation. And we will definitely cherish this. And before we call it a day, I want to make a small announcement. On the next week, on 21st May at 5:30 p.m., we are going to have another seminar on webinar. We will send the link on housing finance. The speakers will be prolific R.V. Verma, who was the chairman of National Housing Bank, then Mr. Raman and Cameron from New Zealand. So those three speakers will be there, and I am sure you will join most of the participants, and we will be formally sending you all this details. Over to Dr.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I have 2 or 3 small points which I forgot. One is, of course, this talk will be on our website. It's recorded, and it will be on our website by tomorrow noon. So those who missed it or others can see it, or they want to repeat seeing it. The second one is slightly unconnected, which I mentioned, Professor, somebody may be interested. We have 3 very innovative papers on COVID at the EGROW Foundation. One related to the spread of COVID from China to the rest of the world. It used some very interesting ways of showing that. This was about a year ago. The second paper was a model of spread of COVID within countries. And the third one, which has just been put on the website today, is about the second wave of COVID in India. So it's probably the first research paper, perhaps jumping the gun, but we have some hypotheses. Obviously, nothing can be proved right now, but we have some interesting hypotheses in the paper. So people who are interested in COVID may want to look at our website with the research papers in the health sector. With that, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Professor, again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.